When the human whispered, "You're beautiful," the alien woman went silent. Junho stepped off the transport shuttle and into the massive arrival hall of Galactic Commerce Station Vala 7, where thousands of beings from dozens of worlds moved through corridors that stretched higher than any building on Earth. And he took a deep breath as he adjusted the translator device behind his ear, knowing that his new assignment would test every skill he had learned in his 5 years as a cultural liaison for the Terran Coalition. The station hummed with activity as merchants haggled, diplomats whispered, and travelers hurried toward destinations unknown. And Junho walked through the crowd with practiced ease, his dark eyes scanning the alien faces around him without staring too long at any single species. Because he had learned early in his career that curiosity could be mistaken for aggression in certain cultures. His datapad buzzed with a message from his supervisor, and he read the briefing one more time as he walked toward the diplomatic wing of the station, where he would meet the Valkyrie representative he had been assigned to assist during the upcoming trade negotiations between the Yaes, Valkyrie Dominion, and the Terran Coalition. The Valkyrie were known throughout the galaxy for their brutal honesty, their mathematical precision, and their complete rejection of anything they considered deceptive, including flattery and empty social pleasantries. And Junho knew that working with them would require him to be direct in ways that might feel uncomfortable for a human raised on politeness and tact. Found the correct conference room and stepped inside, where a tall figure stood near the window overlooking the station's central hub. And when she turned to face him, Junho felt his breath catch for just a moment before he recovered his professional composure. Aelith, the Rannoch, stood nearly 2 meters tall, with gray-blue scaled skin that shimmered under the artificial lights, and her large luminous eyes reflected the stars visible through the window like pools of captured starlight, while bioluminescent patterns traced delicate lines along her arms and neck, pulsing softly with colors that shifted between blue and violet. "You are the human translator," she said, and her voice carried no warmth or hostility, only a flat statement of fact that hung in the air between them. "I am Park Junho, cultural liaison assigned to assist you during the negotiations," he replied with a respectful nod, keeping his tone neutral and his words simple. As the briefing had suggested, "I did not request human assistance," Salis said, turning back to the window as if dismissing him from her attention. "The Terran Coalition insisted, and my superiors agreed only to avoid unnecessary conflict over minor matters." Junho took no offense at her words, because he understood that she was simply being honest according to her culture, and he moved to stand at a respectful distance, giving her space while remaining available. "I will do my best to be useful without being intrusive," he said. And he meant every word. The days that followed were filled with meetings, briefings, and preliminary discussions with representatives from various factions interested in the trade agreement. And Junho watched Salis navigate these interactions with cold efficiency, never wasting words, never engaging in the small talk that other species used to build relationships. He also noticed something else that troubled him. Deeply, other delegates avoided looking at Salis directly, and when they did, their expressions carried something that looked like disgust or pity. And he heard whispers in the corridors that made his chest tighten with an anger he could not express. "The Valkyrie are ugly creatures," a Torvian merchant said to his companion as Salis passed by, not bothering to lower his voice. "Scales and those strange glowing marks, like diseased animals, unpleasant to look upon," his companion agreed. "No wonder they focus only on mathematics and logic, since they have nothing else to offer." Junho watched Salis continue walking without any change in her posture or expression, as if she had not heard the words at all, but he noticed something that he suspected no one else would see, because he had been trained to observe the smallest details of alien physiology, the bioluminescent patterns along her arms dimmed slightly, the colors fading from bright violet to a muted gray, and though her face showed nothing, her body had betrayed a reaction that she could not control. He said nothing to her about what he had witnessed, because he understood that acknowledging it might cause her more discomfort than the original insult. But he made a silent promise to himself that he would not allow such cruelty to continue unchallenged that evening. As the station's artificial lights dimmed to simulate nighttime, Junho sat alone in his quarters and reviewed everything he could find about Velkari culture. Searching for understanding in the dense files of anthropological research that the Coalition had gathered over decades of contact, he learned that the Velkari valued function over form, that their architecture celebrated mathematical precision rather than aesthetic beauty, and that their language contained no words for beauty when applied to living beings, only terms for the elegance of equations or the perfection of geometric designs. He learned that they considered deception to be the greatest sin, which meant that flattery was impossible in their culture, because any compliment that was not objectively verifiable would be seen as a lie. And he learned that Salith Varanak, despite her high position as a diplomat, was considered flawed among her own people, because her bioluminescent patterns were asymmetrical and dimmer than average, a genetic variation that marked her as somehow lesser in a society that prized precision above all else. Junho closed the file and stared at the ceiling of his small room, thinking about a woman who had never been called beautiful by anyone in her entire life, who had grown up in a culture that had no words for such things, and who now faced mockery from aliens who judged her by standards she could not even understand. He did not know what he could do to help her, but he knew that he had to try, because some things were simply right, even when they were difficult. When the human whispered, "You're beautiful," the alien woman went silent. The negotiations entered their second week, and tensions began to rise as competing factions worked to undermine the agreement between the Velkari Dominion and the Terran Coalition, with some parties spreading rumors and others making direct challenges to the terms being discussed. And through it all, Junho remained at Sayla's side like a quiet shadow. He noticed that the attacks against her had become more personal, moving beyond whispered comments in corridors to direct confrontations in meeting rooms. And a delegate from the Kasri Syndicate seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting Salith, with barely concealed insults. Perhaps the Velkari representative would understand our position better if her people were capable of seeing beyond their limited perspective, the Kasri delegate said during one heated discussion, his mandibles clicking with what Junho recognized as amusement. But I suppose we cannot expect creatures who cannot even present themselves properly to grasp the finer points of galactic commerce. The room fell silent as others waited to see how Salith would respond, and Junho felt the anger rising in his chest like fire, burning away his usual calm as he watched this cruel creature mock someone who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Before Salith could speak, Junho stepped forward with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The Kasri delegate raises an interesting point about perspective, he said in a voice as smooth as silk over steel. Perhaps we could discuss how the Kasri Syndicate's own perspective led them to lose 3 major trade routes last cycle due to what the Galactic Commerce Authority called fundamental misunderstandings of basic economic principles. The Kasri delegate's mandibles stopped clicking, and his compound eyes fixed on Junho with sudden hostility. But the human continued, speaking with the same pleasant tone. Of course, I would never suggest that the Kasri are incapable of understanding commerce, Junho added, tilting his head in a gesture that mimicked Kasri body language for deep respect. I am sure that losing only 3 routes was an improvement over previous cycles. Laughter rippled through the room from several delegates who had also suffered from Kasri arrogance. And the Cassari representative sank back in his chair with anger burning in his eyes, but no response forming on his tongue later. After the meeting ended, Salith approached Junho in the corridor with an expression he could not read. "You defended me," she said, and the words sounded almost like an accusation. "I corrected a factual error in the delegate's statement." Junho replied with a small shrug. "The Velkari have demonstrated exceptional understanding of galactic commerce, as proven by your dominion's economic growth over the past century." "That is not what I meant," Salith said, her large eyes studying him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under examination. "You made yourself an enemy of the Cassari Syndicate to shield someone you barely know. And I do not understand why." Junho considered his answer carefully, knowing that honesty was the only currency that held value with the Velkari, because it was the right thing to do. He said simply, "No one should be treated with such disrespect, especially not someone who has worked so hard to bring these negotiations to a successful conclusion." Salith was quiet for a long moment, her bioluminescent patterns flickering in a pattern he had not seen before. And then she spoke in a voice that carried something almost like confusion. "Among my people, no action is taken without expecting something in return," she said. "Every favor creates a debt. Every kindness demands payment. And the idea of helping someone simply because it is right is considered either foolish or deceptive. Humans are strange that way," Junho admitted with a genuine smile. "We often do things without expecting anything back, simply because we feel it is the correct choice. That is illogical," Salith stated. "Probably," he agreed. "But it is who we are." She continued to study him as they walked toward the next meeting room, and Junho could feel her gaze on him like a physical weight, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense over the following days. Salith began to observe Junho more closely, watching how he interacted with other delegates, how he diffused arguments with humor, how he found common ground between species that have been enemies for centuries, and how he did all of this without ever asking for recognition or reward. She noticed that he held doors for beings who did not have hands, that he learned the dietary requirements of every species in the negotiations so he could ensure no one was ever offered food that would harm them, and that he spent his evenings studying cultural documents so he could avoid accidentally offending anyone during discussions. "You invest significant effort in understanding others," she said one evening as they reviewed documents together in a small conference room. "More effort than any being I've observed before. Understanding is the foundation of connection," Junho replied without looking up from his datapad. "And connection is the foundation of peace. Most species seem to believe that power is the foundation of peace," Salith countered. "Most species have not learned what humans have learned," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "That true peace cannot be forced, only built. And that building requires understanding the ones you wish to stand beside." Salith was silent for a long time after that, her patterns pulsing slowly in the dim light of the conference room, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "I do not understand you, Park Junho," she admitted, "but I find that I wish to understand." He smiled at her, a warm expression that carried no agenda and asked for nothing in return, and said only 4 words that somehow contained everything: "Then I will help." When the human whispered, "You're beautiful," the alien woman went silent. The third week of negotiations proved to be the most brutal yet, as the Cassari Syndicate launched a coordinated campaign to destroy the agreement and humiliate the Velkari delegation in the process, using every dirty trick available to undermine Salith's credibility and question her competence. They brought forward false evidence of Velkari treaty violations. They bribed witnesses to give testimony against the Dominion, and they spread rumors that Salith had been sent because she was considered expendable by her own government. A flawed representative for a mission no one expected to succeed, Junho worked tirelessly to counter each attack, staying awake through station night to research counter-evidence, building coalitions with neutral parties who were tired of Cassari manipulation, and using his understanding of galactic politics to predict and prevent each new assault before it could gain momentum. But the cruelest attacks were the ones he could not prevent. The personal comments that found their way to Salith through channels he could not monitor. Messages left on her communication device calling her defective, mocking her patterns, suggesting that she should hide herself from civilized beings who deserved better than to look upon her face. He saw the effect of these attacks in the gradual dimming of her bioluminescent patterns, in the way she held herself more stiffly with each passing day, and in the careful emptiness of her expression that spoke of walls being built higher and stronger with every insult after. A particularly devastating day when a delegate had openly laughed at her during a formal session. Junho found himself alone on an observation deck overlooking a nebula of swirling colors that stretched across half the visible sky. And he stood there in the artificial night, trying to find calm in the beauty of the cosmos. He heard footsteps behind him, but did not turn, recognizing the sound of Valkyrie movement, the slight scrape of scaled feet against the metal floor. And he waited in silence as Salith came to stand beside him at the viewing window. They stood together without speaking for a long time, watching the nebula's colors shift and dance in patterns that had been forming for millions of years. And the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, like a shared breath between friends. Do humans truly find joy in appearance? Salith asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. In surfaces and shapes and colors that serve no practical function? Junho considered the question carefully before answering, sensing that she was asking about something much deeper than aesthetic appreciation. Some humans do, he said. But true beauty, the kind that really matters to us, goes far beyond surfaces. Explain, she said. And it was more a request than a demand. We find beauty in kindness, he said, watching the nebula as he spoke, in strength and resilience, in the way someone keeps fighting when everything tells them to give up, in the way they hold on to their principles, even when it would be easier to let go. Salith was quiet, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something he had never heard from her before, something that sounded almost like pain. Among my people, my bioluminescent patterns are considered defective, she said, and each word seemed to cost her something precious. They are asymmetrical, dimmer than average, and they mark me as flawed in a culture that values precision above all else. She paused, and Junho turned to look at her, seeing how her patterns pulsed weakly in the starlight, how her eyes reflected the distant nebula like mirrors made of sorrow. I have never been called anything but adequate, she continued, never been seen as anything but a functional tool that performs its assigned duties. And I accepted this because I believed it was the truth. And now? Junho asked softly. Now I am mocked by strangers for the same flaws my own people see, she said. And I find myself wondering why it hurts more than it should. Why the words of beings I do not respect can cut deeper than the silence of those I was raised among. Junho felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that spread through him as he looked at this woman who had been told her entire life that she was less than what she should be, who had never known the simple kindness of being seen as worthy, who stood before him now in quiet vulnerability that she had probably never shown to anyone else. The nebula's light caught her scales and made them shimmer, and her patterns pulsed with colors that seemed to dance in harmony with the cosmic clouds behind her. And her eyes held depths that no mathematics could measure, no logic could quantify, and no cruelty could diminish. He spoke without thinking, without planning, without any awareness of what his words might mean beyond the simple truth they contained. "You're beautiful," he whispered. Salith went completely still. Her bioluminescent patterns flared suddenly, blazing brighter than he had ever seen them, painting the observation deck in brilliant shades of blue and violet and colors he did not have names for. And for one perfect moment, she seemed to glow with all the light of the nebula behind her. Then the light died, her patterns dimmed entirely, fading to nothing, leaving her scales dark and colorless in the starlight. And her eyes, those luminous pools that had reflected the cosmos, went flat and empty. She said nothing. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the silent observation deck. And she did not look back as she disappeared into the corridor. Ban Junho stood alone before the nebula, his heart racing with confusion and fear, wondering what he had done wrong, what cultural line he had crossed, what unforgivable mistake he had made by speaking a simple truth that had felt as natural as breathing. He had called her beautiful because she was beautiful, and somehow that had broken something he did not understand. The nebula continued to swirl in its ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of mortal beings. And Junho pressed his hand against the cold window and whispered words that no one heard. "What have I done?" When the human whispered, "You're beautiful," the alien woman went silent. The days that followed were agony for Park Junho, who found himself cut off from Salith entirely as she refused all contact, canceled their scheduled meetings, and communicated only through official channels, using formal language that contained no trace of the connection they had begun to build. The negotiations stalled without her direct involvement, and other delegates began to whisper that the Velkari had grown tired of dealing with humans, that the agreement was falling apart, that Junho had somehow offended the stoic diplomat and ruined everything his people had worked to achieve. Sent messages through the station's communication system, formal requests for meetings to discuss the negotiations, and each one was rejected with polite bureaucratic responses that said nothing and revealed less. He tried waiting outside her quarters, hoping to catch her in the corridor, but she seemed to sense his presence and took alternate routes that kept her invisible to him. He considered knocking on her door and demanding an explanation, but something told him that forcing the issue would only make things worse, that whatever he had broken required understanding before it could be repaired. So he did what he had always done when faced with a problem he could not solve through action. Alone he researched. Junho spent his nights in the station's cultural archive, a vast digital library containing information about every known species in the galaxy, and he dove deep into the files on Velkari society, searching for any clue that might explain why his words had caused such a devastating reaction. He learned that the Velkari language had evolved over millennia to eliminate ambiguity, with every word carrying precise meaning that could not be misunderstood, and that their rejection of flattery stemmed from a historical period when lies had nearly destroyed their civilization, leading to a cultural revolution that prioritized truth above all else. He learned that their bioluminescent patterns were not merely decorative, but served as an unconscious emotional display that they could not fully control, revealing feelings that their words and expressions might hide. And that Salith's patterns had gone dark in a response that the files described as pattern shock, a rare condition triggered by overwhelming emotional input. And then, in an obscure academic paper written by a human xenolinguist who had spent decades studying the Velkari, he found what he was looking for. Paper discussed an ancient Velkari concept called Varth, a word so old and sacred that it had nearly fallen out of common usage, surviving only in religious texts and historical records from before the Cultural Revolution that had transformed their society. Varth did not translate directly into any human language, but the closest approximation was that which makes the universe worth perceiving, a phrase that encompassed beauty, meaning, purpose, and love in a single concept that the ancient Valkyrie had considered the highest possible truth one being could speak about another to. Call someone Vorith was not a compliment. In any ordinary sense, it was a declaration of profound connection. A statement that the speaker's very existence had been enriched and justified by the presence of the other. A bond that in ancient times was spoken only once in a lifetime and carried implications of permanent commitment. The modern Valkyrie had no word for beauty when applied to people, because Vorith had encompassed that concept entirely. And when the Cultural Revolution had pushed such emotional expressions to the margins of society, the idea of calling someone beautiful had become lost along with it. When Junho had whispered those two simple words to Salith, his translator had done its job too well, finding the closest equivalent in her language and speaking directly to something buried so deep in Valkyrie consciousness that even Salith might not have recognized it immediately. He had called her Vorith, the most sacred thing one Valkyrie could say to another, and she had heard it from an alien who could not possibly understand what he was saying, who had spoken world-changing words as if they meant nothing, who had casually offered her something that her own people had denied her for her entire life. No wonder she had fled. No wonder she could not face him. Junho closed the files and sat in the empty archive, his head in his hands, trying to understand what he should do with this knowledge. Whether he should apologize for speaking words he had not meant to speak, or whether the truth was something far more complicated, because the truth was that he had meant what he said, even if he had not understood the full weight of his words. And now he had to decide whether to run from that meaning or run toward. I submitted a formal request for a meeting with Salith through official diplomatic channels, using language that could not be ignored without causing an incident between their governments. She rejected. I'd submitted a second request, citing the stalled negotiations as justification for an urgent face-to-face discussion. She rejected that one as well. He submitted a third request, and this time he added a single line in Valkyrie script that he had practiced for hours until the characters were perfect. I understand what I said. I need to know if I was wrong to say it. The response came within an hour. A single word in Valkyrie that his translator rendered as accepted, and a meeting. Time for the final day of the scheduled negotiations. Junho stared at the message and felt his heart beating like a drum in his chest, knowing that everything would be decided in that meeting, that he would either repair what he had broken or lose something precious that he had only begun to understand. He had spoken words that could bind two people together across the vastness of space and the differences of biology. And now he had to face the woman he had accidentally promised himself to and tell her whether he had meant it. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor. When the human whispered, "You're beautiful," the alien woman went silent. The private meeting chamber was small and quiet, tucked away in a corner of the diplomatic wing where no one would disturb them. And Junho arrived early because he could not stand waiting any longer. His nerves stretched tight as he rehearsed words that scattered like startled birds. Every time he tried to hold on to them, Salith entered exactly on time. Her movements precise and controlled, her bioluminescent patterns dim but visible, pulsing with colors that seemed uncertain, as if they could not decide whether to shine or hide. She stood across the table from him and said nothing, waiting for him to speak first. And Junho realized that this was her gift to him, the chance to explain before she passed judgment. "I researched what I said to you," he began, his voice steady despite the trembling in his chest. "I found the word Varith in the old texts, and I understand now why you reacted the way you did." Salith's patterns flickered, a brief flash of violet that faded quickly, but she remained silent. "Among my people, calling someone beautiful is common," he continued. "It is a compliment, a kindness. Something we say to friends and lovers and even strangers when we want to make them feel valued. And I did not know that your translator would turn my words into something so much more. You spoke Vareth to me, Salith said, and her voice carried an edge he could not identify. A concept so sacred that my people have nearly forgotten it. A bond that in ancient times would have joined two souls together for all their remaining days. And you spoke it as if it were nothing. I did not know, Junho said, but I need to tell you something else. Something that matters more than my ignorance. She tilted her head slightly. The Valkyrie gestured for attention, and he took a deep breath before continuing. When I called you beautiful, I meant it, he said. Not in the casual way humans often use the word. Not as empty flattery or social politeness, but as genuine truth that I felt in my heart and spoke without thinking because it was simply real. Salith's patterns began to pulse more strongly, shifting through colors that he had learned to associate with powerful emotion. You are Vareth to me. Salith, he said, and he spoke the word carefully, pronouncing it the way the old recordings had taught him. I did not know that word when I spoke to you on the observation deck, but I know it now. And I know that it describes exactly what I felt when I looked at you and saw someone who made the universe worth perceiving. You cannot mean that, she said, but her voice wavered in a way that betrayed her uncertainty. You are human. I am Valkyrie. We have known each other for mere weeks. And Vareth is not spoken carelessly by anyone who understands its weight. Humans are strange, Junho said, and he smiled despite the tension. We fall in love quickly. We speak our hearts before our minds can catch up. And we make promises that might seem foolish to more logical species. But we mean them, Salith. We mean them with everything we are. Love? She repeated, and the word seemed to confuse her. That is the human word for what the ancients called Vareth. Close enough, he said. Different in some ways, similar in others. But what matters is that I looked at you and saw someone extraordinary. Someone strong and resilient and determined. Someone who has faced mockery and rejection without breaking. Someone whose patterns are not flawed but unique. Someone who deserved to hear what no one had ever told her before. Salith was quiet for a long moment, her patterns now blazing with light that filled the small chamber with color, and when she finally spoke, her voice was different than he had ever heard it, soft, vulnerable, almost frightened. You broke something in me, she said. A wall I built over decades of being told I was lesser, of learning to accept that I would never be seen as anything but adequate. And you broke it with two words that I could not understand and could not ignore. I am sorry for the pain, Junho said, but I am not sorry for speaking the truth. Humans are terrifying, she said. And she stepped around the table to stand before him, her luminous eyes meeting his. You speak world-changing words as though they are nothing. You offer bonds that my people would spend lifetimes building toward. And then you mean them. You actually mean them. And that is more frightening than anything I've ever faced. Does that mean you believe me? He asked. She reached out and touched his face, her scaled fingers cool against his skin. And her patterns blazed so brightly that he could feel their warmth. It means I am considering it, she said. And something in her voice might have been humor. The negotiations concluded successfully that afternoon, with the Valkyrie Dominion and the Terran Coalition signing an agreement that would benefit both species for generations to come. And the delegates who had tried so hard to undermine the process could only watch in frustrated silence as Salith and Junho stood side by side, their partnership somehow stronger than all the opposition arrayed against them. Months later, on Earth, Junho received a transmission from the Valkyrie homeworld, encrypted with codes that only he could unlock, containing coordinates for a location in Valkyrie space and a single word that his translator rendered as untranslatable, a new word, created by combining Vareth with a Valkyrie suffix that indicated reciprocity, mutuality. A bond that flowed in both directions. She had made him Varth, too. He smiled as he booked passage on the next ship toward those coordinates, imagining Salith waiting for him on a world he had never seen. Her patterns blazing with colors that meant welcome and hope, and something deeper than words in any language could express as the ship lifted off from Earth and climbed toward the stars. He whispered the word she had sent him, tasting its foreign syllables on his human tongue, knowing that he was traveling toward a future that neither of their species had imagined possible, and somewhere in the galaxy, a Valkyrie woman with asymmetrical patterns and luminous eyes looked up at the stars and smiled in a way her people had almost forgotten how to smile, because a strange human had looked at her and seen something beautiful, and then had meant it, the universe. They had both discovered was worth perceiving after all.